The Nazis are remembered for their brutality and terror, but their punishments were among the most inhumane ever recorded in history. Under Adolf Hitler's rule, the Third Reich established a system of cruel and degrading punishments designed to instill fear, crush dissent, and maintain control over both the general population and its enemies. The tactics they employed went beyond mere physical pain. They aimed to destroy the very essence of the human spirit. One of the most terrifying aspects of Nazi rule was the establishment of concentration camps, which became infamous for their unimaginable suffering. Prisoners, including Jews, Romani people, political dissidents, disabled individuals, and others labels, were subjected to forced labor, malnutrition, abuse, and often death. These camps were scattered across Europe, from Auschwitz to Dachau, and were designed not only to imprison but to dehumanize their victims. Torture, starvation, and physical abuse were standard practices, and the prisoners lived under the constant threat of execution. Perhaps one of the most horrifying forms of punishment during the Nazi era was medical experimentation. Nazi doctors, most notably Dr. Joseph Mengele, conducted horrific experiments on prisoners, many of whom were children. These experiments were carried out without consent and often resulted in death or permanent injury. Mengel's infamous experiments included injecting victims with diseases, subjecting them to extreme temperatures, and even performing sterilization procedures without anesthesia. These inhumane experiments reflected the Nazis' twisted ideology of racial superiority, treating human beings as mere subjects in a horrifying quest for knowledge that had no regard for human life. Another chilling method of punishment was the death march. As the Allies closed in on the Third Reich, the Nazis moved prisoners from one camp to another in brutal marches. Prisoners were forced to walk for days or even weeks, often in the freezing cold or scorching heat, with little to no food or water. Those who fell behind or collapsed were shot on the spot. Thousands of innocent men, women, and children died during these death marches, which epitomized the Nazis' willingness to show no mercy, even as the war was coming to an end. Public executions were another tool of Nazi terror. The regime used these executions not just to kill, but to create fear in the populace. Men and women who were suspected of being part of resistance movements, or even those caught attempting to escape the regime's control, were subjected to brutal public displays of punishment. In many cases, victims were shot or hanged in front of crowds as a way of making an example out of them. These public executions were not just about the act of killing, it was about instilling terror into the hearts of the people, making them afraid to even think of rebellion. The Nazis wanted to crush any hope of resistance through fear. But even more horrifying than these punishments were the gas chambers and crematoria used in the death camps. The systematic extermination of Jews and other minorities through the Holocaust remains one of the most brutal genocides in human history. Victims were lured into what they were told were showers, only to be sealed inside gas chambers where they were killed with poisonous gas. The bodies were then burned in the crematoria, eliminating any evidence of the atrocities. The Nazis had perfected the art of mass murder, using technology to carry out their cruelty efficiently. For them, these killings were not just about punishment. They were about erasing an entire race and culture. The brutality of the Nazi regime extended beyond just killing. Forced labor was another method of punishment. Prisoners were used as free labor to build Nazi infrastructure, work in factories, or assist in the war effort. However, the labor was grueling, and those who were too weak to continue were killed or left to die from exhaustion. Workers were often given little to no food, forced to work in unsafe conditions, and beaten for the slightest infraction. This type of punishment was not only about physical pain but also about stripping away a person's dignity and humanity. Another horrifying aspect of Nazi punishment was their treatment of prisoners of war. Soviet soldiers captured by the Nazis were subjected to some of the worst treatment of any group. They were treated as subhuman and were often left to die in the most brutal ways, including starvation, disease, and execution. Many were forced into labor camps, where they had little chance of survival. This disregard for life reflected the Nazis' twisted ideology, which viewed people as nothing more than expendable resources. Perhaps one of the most tragic consequences of these punishments was their long-lasting psychological impact. Survivors of the concentration camps and the Nazi regime were left to carry the emotional and mental scars of what they had endured. Many lived with the trauma of their experiences for the rest of their lives. The psychological toll of the beatings, starvation, and loss of loved ones was profound. Yet, even in the face of such horrors, the resilience of the human spirit shone through. Many survivors went on to share their stories, ensuring that the world would never forget the atrocities committed by the Nazis. As we reflect on the Nazi punishments that were carried out during World War II, it is essential to remember the millions of people who suffered under the regime. These punishments were not just acts of cruelty. They were part of a broader system designed to break the will of the people, strip them of their humanity, and instill a sense of fear that would allow the Nazis to maintain their totalitarian control. The legacy of these punishments and the memories of those who survived continue to serve as a reminder of the horrors that can arise when hatred and violence are allowed to flourish unchecked. As the Nazi regime's war effort escalated, so did its methods of control and punishment. The tactics used by the Nazis were not just aimed at immediate suppression, but were intended to instill a deep sense of fear, terror, and hopelessness in both the occupied territories and within Germany itself. These punishments were meant to break not just the bodies of their victims, but also their spirits, rendering them helpless and obedient to the will of the Third Reich. The sheer brutality of the Nazi system left its mark on history, with the scars of the past continuing to reverberate today. One of the most infamous forms of punishment was the death camp system, which was at the center of the Holocaust. These camps, like Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Buchenwald, were not only places of death but centers of torture and suffering. Prisoners were subjected to unimaginable conditions of cruelty, with many enduring physical abuse, forced labor, starvation, and unimaginable psychological torment. The gas chambers were the most efficient tool the Nazis used to carry out mass murder, killing thousands in a single day. The Nazis made sure that the victims, often Jews, Romani people, political dissidents, and other undesirables, were stripped of their dignity in every way possible. They were made to leave behind their belongings, their families, and their lives in the most inhumane conditions. In addition to the gas chambers, the Nazis employed medical experiments that are still horrifying to think about. One of the most notorious figures in this regard was Dr. Joseph Mengele, who conducted brutal experiments on thousands of prisoners, often without anesthesia or consent. These experiments included injections of deadly diseases, unnecessary surgeries, and attempts to alter physical traits like eye color. Mengele and other Nazi doctors performed these tests under the guise of scientific research, but the true objective was to further the Nazi ideology of racial superiority. The survivors of these experiments were often left with lifelong disabilities, both physical and psychological, and many of them did not survive the cruel trials. The treatment of Soviet prisoners of war stands as another example of Nazi cruelty. As the war dragged on and the Nazi forces suffered more defeats, their treatment of captured Soviet soldiers became increasingly brutal. The Nazis viewed the Soviet soldiers as subhuman and subjected them to horrific conditions, including forced marches, starvation, and execution. Soviet posts were often left to die in makeshift camps where disease and malnutrition ran rampant. They were used as slave laborers, forced to build fortifications or work in mines with little hope of survival. Many were subjected to public executions or shot on sight, as the Nazis sought to extinguish any resistance or even the hope of revolt among the captured. Another chilling form of punishment was forced sterilization. The Nazis saw the people they considered undesirable, including the disabled, mentally ill, and those with hereditary diseases, as threats to the future of the Aryan race. They implemented a policy of eugenics that sought to rid the population of people who were viewed as genetically inferior. Forced sterilization was carried out in both the concentration camps and in hospitals throughout Germany. Victims were often unaware of what was happening to them until after the procedure had been done. For many, this punishment had long-lasting psychological effects, as it robbed them not only of their biological function but also of their dignity. One of the most disturbing punishments, particularly for those who defied the Nazis or were suspected of resisting, was the public execution. These executions were not carried out quietly or in private. Instead, the Nazis used public spaces to display their power and make an example of anyone who dared to challenge them. Resistance fighters, political dissidents, or anyone caught conspiring against the Nazis were often hanged, shot, or brutally executed in front of crowds. The purpose was to strike terror into the heart of the populace, reminding them of the consequences of disobedience. The Nazi regime believed that fear was one of their most powerful tools, and they used these executions to maintain control over both their enemies and the general public. Perhaps one of the most shocking aspects of Nazi punishments was the destruction of family bonds. Not only were individuals punished, but entire families were targeted. Many children, especially Jewish children, were separated from their families and sent to ghettos, forced labor camps, or death camps. The emotional trauma of being torn apart from loved ones was an additional form of punishment, as it served to break the will of families and individuals. This destruction of family structure was a deliberate tactic, intended to prevent any form of rebellion or resistance from forming within communities. The death marches, which took place during the final days of the war, were among the most horrendous forms of punishment meted out by the Nazis. As the Allies advanced, the Nazis evacuated prisoners from their camps, forcing them to march long distances in brutal conditions. The prisoners were subjected to exhaustion, starvation, disease, and even death along the way. Those who were too weak to keep up were shot or left to die in the snow. These death marches were a final act of cruelty, a last reminder of the Nazis' ability to destroy life, even as the end of their regime was drawing near. Despite the terrifying brutality of the Nazis and the inhumane punishments they devised, there were still those who resisted. Many of the victims fought back in whatever ways they could, whether it was through small acts of defiance or larger organized efforts like the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. These acts of resistance proved that, even in the face of overwhelming terror, the human spirit could not be entirely crushed. The legacy of Nazi punishment is not just one of terror, it is also one of resilience. And it serves as a reminder that even in the darkest times, the human spirit can persist.